Are we returning to the 1970s, Kamal? Obviously, there's this raft of measures designed to help the British worker. I don't think they're quite what Angela Rayner had planned initially. I think she wanted to go sort of fully fledged Red Scargill and talk about increasing the minimum wage and doing all sorts of things. Clearly, and this has been the case for Keir Starmer all along, since the 2020 leadership pitch to now, he's had to become a bit more blue Labour about his approach because, of course, they don't want to completely alienate businesses. They're on a low vote share. They've got to look as if they're not being too radical and too Jeremy Corbyn. What have we ended up with, though?
So I think there are two things here. There is the story, which sounds a bit like the 1970s, the unions being involved in policy making with government, which we've not heard for all the years of not only the last Tory government, but frankly the last Labour government. So there's a new tone. But just to kind of reassure everyone who does remember my generation, power cuts, the bins in the streets, those battles, I was only a little boy, you had strikes that took up millions and millions of days a year of working life. The union membership in the 1970s was over 13 million. It's half that now. We're not in that state, obviously. We don't have inflation. We don't have high inflation now anymore. We don't have many millions of people facing unemployment. But I think there is this political change, which is the unions, who don't represent as many people as they used to, are now much more embedded. And we have a problem with funding our public services, which links to the idea of we're going to have to tax, because Labour has said it calls it austerity, but actually it means efficiency. It doesn't want to cut public services budgets. So there are some similar problems, but we don't have the crises of the 1970s at the moment.
Shall we run through the nitty-gritty of
Yes.
what's actually in this bill? So on flexible working, that is to become the default, with employers required to accommodate requests as far as reasonable. This could include compressing full-time hours into a 4-day week. Quite hard to define that, Kamal, as far as is reasonable. I suppose that puts the onus on employers to push against employees who want to work flexibly. But it's not a one-size-fits-all, is it?
No, and they want to increase parental leave rights, sick pay rights, protection from unfair dismissal, and make those rights available from day one. They want to ban what they are describing as exploitative 0 hours contracts. They say that they want to ban fire and rehire. This is when a company, often in very poor financial health, fires its present staff and then rehires on lower wages to keep the business solvent. A new regulator called the Fair Work Agency, and this very vague idea, the right to switch off, this idea that outside working hours, maybe after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., employees have no duty to respond to any work requests.
We wish. Just on the right to switch off. That's not going to be legislative for. That's just going to be a sort of guidance to employers.
The problem we have with all these things, just as you spotted with that first one around the flexible working, it's all about reasonable requests. The issue I have with all of these points that have been put forward by the Labour Party today, who is demanding them? I'm not aware that in the election campaign, the public was saying, one of the biggest issues I have is the insecurity of my work, or one of the biggest issues I have is 0 hours contracts. Many people like 0 hours contracts, many freelancers like them. And having the government involved in how business runs itself is always an extra burden on business. Labour has a problem with a lack of business experience in its senior ministers. Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, he was out on the morning media rounds today saying how this was great for business and this would be fine for business and business would really understand. Well, he doesn't know that because he's never been involved in a private business. There's very little business experience across the whole of cabinet or any of the ministerial ranks of Labour. And you can really feel traditional Labour here in this whole conversation. This has been led by Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, who's very close to the unions. And there is this problem for someone like Jonathan Reynolds. I remember Peter Mandelson saying formerly the business secretary. The business secretary in a Labour government can go either of two ways. Is that person representing business to the government or representing the government to business? And his argument was the business secretary should be representing business to government, because without powerful wealth creation, profitable businesses, we will never get the growth that we need to fix the public finances. What we're seeing in this administration is that Johnny Reynolds is representing the government to business. And I would suggest that's the wrong way round.
When you say about what are people worried about on the doorstep when it comes to workers' rights, I think there have been concerns expressed in the past that people turning up in the morning at a factory and not knowing whether they can work or not, that's really unstable. I think most people on the right want people to be in gainful and meaningful employment. Do you know, I was once in a union, Kamal. I once went on strike with the NUJ.
National Union of Journalists, which is the main journalist union. Yep.
Which was because we were having arbitrary redundancies. People were being asked to double their workload. They weren't being offered any more pay. It struck everybody as completely unfair. We do hear of cases, for instance, I can't bear it when I hear of women who are on maternity leave suddenly coming back to work and realising that their position has been removed or that they've been constructively dismissed. So in that regard, I think most ordinary people believe in workers' rights. But don't they also think that we have good workers' rights anyway? They think to themselves, actually, conversely to this Labour narrative, it's actually quite difficult these days to get rid of people. You know, good employees are as frustrated as good employers when they can't get rid of somebody who is rubbish, when they can't actually discipline somebody who isn't turning up on time, who isn't delivering in their role, and is therefore putting pressure on everyone else to carry them. So this whole idea that we're living in this kind of 1970s redux, I think, is probably for the birds. Also, instinctively, I think people say to themselves, yes, of course, I want my rights as a worker to be protected, but I don't want the government bringing in measures that could put my employer out of business, that could basically say to my employer, oh God, I don't know if we can afford to implement all this. I think we're probably going to have to reduce the headcount. That is totally counterintuitive, that you're bringing in protections for workers that could actually make small and medium-sized businesses think twice about expansion and putting food on your table.
There's not many people, I think, who would reasonably argue in the private sector, which of course provides 85% of all jobs in the UK and creates all profit. The state can only spend other people's profits. It can't spend its own money. Margaret Thatcher's famous line. Our job sector is not under-regulated. One of the key issues around growth, and if you look at America, is that flexibility actually means you get much more entrepreneurialism, because people can start businesses. They don't feel that there's too much risk in hiring people, that there should be flexible workforces who are able to move around and expand as the business expands, but sometimes contract as the business contracts. If you think back to Jonathan Reynolds saying in one of his first interviews once he'd become business secretary that working from home was good for business and more productive.
Yes.
Well, if it is good for business and more productive, business will do it. It doesn't
Yes.
need Jonathan Reynolds, a lawyer and a counsellor and now a politician, to tell businesses that.
I mean,
They
as
will
well,
do
that
it
was the same week that the Amazon boss said, actually, we would like people to return to the office.
because they were lacking, because they didn't understand the Amazon way. And actually, Amazon was struggling as a business because too many people were working from home. So it's this idea that somehow an academic understanding of business is sufficient to be able to tell business what to think. And of course, it was the following weekend that then Rachel Reeves gave a contradictory interview in one of the Sunday papers and said, I demanded that everyone was in work in the Treasury.
Yes.
So there's this very kind of confused point of view.
But every workplace is different. This is the thing, even looking out into the newsroom now, populated with people that have to physically be here to do their jobs, like you and I in this studio. Plenty of other jobs in journalism don't require you to be here, and you can do those jobs from home. Doesn't the market also adapt when it comes to Our generation, I think, is a bit different. We grew up expecting to have to go into the office. To an extent, that changed in the last 10 to 20 years with the advent of the internet. And certainly, we've crossed a bit of a Rubicon when it comes to COVID. For instance, back in the day when you were at the BBC, the idea of interviewing people down the line would be anathema. You've always got to get someone in the studio. We've adapted. We now do remote interviews and all the rest of it. The next generation, the Gen Zs and beyond, they are going to be expecting to be treated in a flexible way as far as their presenteeism, and the market will then dictate. The companies that can attract the brightest and the best a little bit on their terms as well as on the employer's terms are going to be thriving, and those that are a bit Luddite, those who turn around to younger people and say, you absolutely have to do a 9 to 5, are probably going to fail. So isn't that the thing? Isn't that why capitalism rather than socialism works? Because people can do things in their own way. And if those methods aren't successful, those companies fail. And if they have to adapt to a more modern approach with more flexible working and more rights for women and all the rest of it, then they thrive and do better. And that's how they succeed. Rather than this lowest common denominator approach.
I think there's a tension in Labour, which I think we will see played out in many, many policy areas between what we might describe as traditional Labour and more entrepreneurial Labour. And I think Rachel Reeves better reflects the second of those. There's been some tension between the Treasury and the Business Department and Jonathan Reynolds, and between Jonathan Reynolds and Angela Rayner,
yes,
the Deputy Prime Minister, who is leading a lot of this work. And it does link into the Conservative leadership campaign, because it was Kemi Badenoch, one of obviously the last two now, going forward to the party to see who will become leader of the opposition, who actually rather smartly trapped Angela Rayner in this conversation by pointing out to her that she had actually lost a lot of her powers to other departments, even though she was the supposed lead of the workers' rights package. Let's just hear how Kemi Badenoch landed that point.
I can tell the Right Honourable Lady that she has been stitched up. It is quite clear that the bills and policies from the King's speech she's just referenced have not been written by her, but by the Chancellor and the Chancellor's advisors. We all know this because we watched the member for Leeds West announce them in far more detail in her speech last week. And all the stuff the Secretary of State worked on in opposition, like her new deal for workers, has been taken off her and given to the Business Secretary. So I'm sorry to tell the Right Honourable Lady that her colleagues, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and their many advisors have written a manifesto and made promises that are not deliverable, and they've hung them around her neck and said, Angie, you go out there and you sell it.
That is why people have been backing Badenoch, because they think that she can run rings around this Labour administration, at times at odds with itself. Incidentally, Jonathan Reynolds is the only cabinet minister that refuses to come on my GB News show. Seems to think I roughed him up the first and only time he came on and hasn't come back, which strikes me as somebody who's lacking in their conviction in their own policies and beliefs if they don't think that they can stand them up against a journalistic inquiry.
Exactly. People who run away from interviews, it says much more about them than it says about the interviewee. I remember going through all the pain of Boris Johnson refusing to be interviewed by Andrew Neil. It said a lot more about Boris Johnson and that he wanted to be the Prime Minister but didn't want to appear before Andrew Neil.
The other thing about this, Kamal, which strikes me as a little curious, why is all this taking so long? None of this is going to come into being until 2026.
They trapped themselves, didn't they, in this? Or they didn't trap themselves. They thought it looked good when they said, we will produce these plans within 100 days of the new government. I think that is officially Saturday, the 100 days of this new government. So they've got the plan out there, but of course you have to consult on the plan. And they've said they're going to consult for 2 years. So business has now got these rather vague ideas around flexible working and 0 hours contracts and hire and fire and rehire and a new workers regulator. I mean, that really does make brings the hairs up on the back of my neck. Yet another regulator for business. And they're going to have to wait for 2 years of talk. That's halfway through this administration. What they're saying, we must do things quickly.
Yeah.
We must be aggressive. And we'll take 2 years. That's literally 2026.
That's the difference between governance and business. Can you imagine a business turning around and saying, yeah, we need to run this up the flagpole. We're going to take 24 months and then we'll come back with an answer.
I think Labour have an extra problem as well. They tend to think of business as one lump of things, and that actually is usually bigger business. And frankly, for big businesses with tens of thousands of employees, the big banks, the big retailers, they've got big HR departments. They can sort of deal with new rules. They're very used to rules and regulations, and they have lots and lots of people who know how to deal with them. The issue actually for many, many businesses that are far smaller is that any new rules become an existential threat to the business, because anything that changes the bottom line, your ability to make profit, your ability to be flexible, becomes actually a risk to your business. And you don't have a big HR department. You don't have hundreds of people to make sure you're following all these new regulations and engaging with this new Fair Work Agency regulator. But someone who can talk about that much more powerfully than I can is Dave Hale. He is the head of public affairs at the Federation of Small Businesses. David, thank you so much for joining us and discussing these new Labour plans, which they have published pretty rapidly after the general election. Dave, what's your response overall to the package?
Look, there's a lot to be potentially concerned about in the package, and also the rushed way in which this has come about means that there's more than 1 million small employers that have woken up this morning to a package of 28 different measures that the government is not clear about exactly what they mean, that the government is saying will take a long time to get right. And just the sheer amount of stuff, as well as what's in it, is potentially a real problem, and is a real problem already, because already you're confusing people, you're worrying people, and you're making people concerned.
And what impact does that have on actually how you run your business? I ran my own business for 3 years. And when you run a small business, we had 60 employees. When you run a small business, every penny in and every penny out really matters.
Every penny in, every penny out matters, and every hour of your time matters. And that's if this stuff all comes in, is that you spending hours getting to grips with the rules instead of talking to staff about how they want to work, how they could work better, how you could work better with them? Or is it, there are people that will have had job interviews today, and there will have been a big message from the government that says, if you get this wrong, if you take a risk with someone that maybe doesn't have the experience that you were hoping for, you could get dragged through the courts for a year or more. Is that what we want? Is that the right message to send? And I think some of this is just a difficulty transferring from opposition into government, where what you say really matters, and it matters to business confidence, and it matters day to day for whether people are getting into the jobs that they want, and whether the small businesses in the UK are able to grow.
Dave, how are small and medium-sized businesses feeling? What's the mood at the moment? Because we've got this. We've also got the threat of tax rises in the budget that's going to be delivered by Rachel Reeves on October the 30th. Even today, we've got the Institute for Fiscal Studies warning that tax increases of 25 billion a year may be needed to fulfil some of the commitments that the Labour Party are making. And you've got Rishi Sunak in the House of Commons at Prime Minister's questions, sort of asking about whether there might be increases to employer national insurance contributions. We appreciate the Labour Party has ruled out taxes on what they define as working people. They haven't ruled out taxes on businesses.
Well, the Labour Party did, and was very clear in the general election, and was very clear both to the business community and in its manifesto to the public and to the millions of small businesses in the country, that it would not raise national insurance, and that very much includes employers' national insurance. So I think any speculation of a breach of that, I think if that was true, it would seriously undermine small businesses' confidence. I think more widely, small businesses. I think if you asked me on July the 5th, this was there was a whole general election campaign where it was growth, 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 where there was talk of a positive partnership with business, including small businesses. And since then, there has been endless speculation about tax rises, including this stuff not yet ruled out today, and also this package of measures that frankly should have been led with a reassurance message to small businesses that the time would be taken to get it right. But that's not how it feels, I don't think, to many people.
It's interesting, isn't it, for the economy? So much is about mood and confidence. It's really important that people who run businesses or are involved in businesses, work for small businesses, feel confident. That does actually mean that you behave more entrepreneurially, you'll be more innovative, you will take more risks. One of the big things, Dave, that they have said is about this probationary period. So although they want to bring in more rights for workers from day one, they have said that workers will actually have longer periods of probation, which I think would actually be off-putting to have a feeling that you're getting into a job and you're on probation for 9 months. I mean, at the moment, many businesses will have a period of 3 months where people can then just split and it can be very, very light touch, a worker and an employer. But 9 months probation, Dave, seems to me to be an awfully long time, not just for the employer, but for the employee.
Well, I think this is the clearest example of what happens when you rush legislation, because they are not talking about having probation periods that are 9 months. They are talking about having a starting period that is 9 months, and they're not talking about contractual probation at all. And that's not what it means. But they have rushed to such an extent that they have this statutory probation period. That is not what it sounds like it means. That will create extra layers of confusion, both for staff and for employees. Like, that is one of the clear things that needs to change in the bill as it passes forward. They need to be very clear about what that means. I think it's very positive that they are looking at that period being 9 months. I think that is welcome. I think it needs to go to 12. That's not 9 or 12 months of probation. That's 9 or 12 months of, if you give somebody a chance, you will not get dragged through the courts. And they need to make sure that they are very, very clear that there can be no tribunal risk in those 9 to 12 months. Because if they are not clear on that, people who need to be hired and we need to get into the workforce will not be hired. And I hope that the government has recognised that. But really, it shouldn't be for business alone to make the point about needing to hire people and needing to get people into the workforce. That should be a government point. It should be a trade union point. It should be a business point. It certainly should be a treasury and a fiscal point. And I think at the moment, business has been left on its own to make that argument and make that grown-up argument about the future of the economy. And these are the things that they need to take the time to get it right.
Given that it appears that Jonathan Reynolds, who's the business secretary, who was using the word probation all morning today, do you think he understands business? It seems like you're suggesting he doesn't even understand what a probationary period actually is.
No, I think Jonathan Reynolds is someone we have talked to for a long time in opposition. We have talked to for a long time in government. Decisions on legislation are decisions for the whole government and the whole cabinet. And it is the whole government and the whole cabinet that needs to take responsibility for this legislation. I think Jonathan Reynolds has done some good stuff on late payment, but at the moment it's being drowned out by all of this noise on tax and this noise on, frankly, the lawyers will need to get involved every time you take an employment decision. And that's poor, and they've got to get the balance better.
Dave Hale, thank you very much indeed for joining us from the offices of the Federation for Small Businesses. Thank you. I'm listening to Dave there, Kamal, thinking, is it possible for a party to be both the party of workers and the party of business?
It is, because workers and business, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the groups who try to sort of divide that somehow there's the workers and they're up against the kind of bosses.
Yes.
That is not how modern economies work. Anyone who's run their own business knows that if you are not completely intertwined on a journey with your teams, with your colleagues, with your staff, all endeavouring to make your business successful. This idea of workers and bosses is, we've talked about this being the 1970s
yeah.
all over again. You know that we are punctiliously fair on the Daily Tea, of course.
Yes, we try
Camilla.
to be.
And he did mention there, and I just didn't want to pick up on it, on late payment. The Federation of Small Businesses got in touch with me, and Labour has said there are going to be new rules on obliging particularly big companies to pay their small suppliers quickly.
Yes.
And they have put that in place. So I just want to say there are some things where the FSB, the British Chambers of Commerce, the organisations that represent smaller businesses where late payment is such a problem, Labour have moved on that, and that has been welcomed. So, as always, it is a nuanced picture, but one small good thing, as David Hale said, has been outweighed by this long, vague list of extra regulation.